Good morning, church. Good to be with you again. We've been following Paul along his second missionary journey the last several times that I've been speaking, and we're going to continue today. If you remember, last time he was in the city of Athens. This week, we're going to be following Paul through the city of Corinth. And again, in the year 2014, my family and I were able to go visit Corinth, just as we were Athens, so I have some pictures from there, and we'll do a little bit of a history lesson and kind of a show and tell here at the beginning, and then we'll move into Acts chapter 18, which is where we see his time that is spent in the city of Corinth. Corinth was a very geographically important city because it was situated kind of as a gateway in between Rome to the west and Asia to the east. And as we begin to look at some of these pictures, you'll see the importance of it. This first picture shows Greece. We can see the Peloponnese there in the yellow at the southern aspect of Greece. And off onto the west or to the left on this slide would be Rome, and off onto the right or to the east would be Asia. And so one of the difficult things was if you wanted to travel from the west to the east, you would have to travel around the Peloponnese. And that was a very dangerous voyage because you had a mixing of different temperatures of waters, and you would get very dangerous currents, which would make it very easy to sink ships. Very similar to at the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. You've probably read or remember in school learning about how dangerous it was to sail around that southern aspect of Africa. It's the same thing. The southern aspect of Greece, very dangerous, and it took a long time to navigate that southern route around the bottom of Greece. So if you wanted to quickly move across, they had decided way back in the 7th century BC, wouldn't it be great if we could cut across this small isthmus of land which is just adjacent to the city of Corinth? And so Periander, who was one of the original tyrants of Corinth way back in the 7th century BC, said, you know what, maybe we should cut across this isthmus, and then wouldn't that shorten the trip from the west to the east, from the Gulf of Corinth to the Saronic Gulf on the east side, and it would be so much less treacherous, less dangerous. And so he actually brought in engineers. They brought in engineers actually from Egypt. And as they began to evaluate the scope of the project and what it would take to do this, they came up with some concerns. For one thing, and this blue line, this blue little squiggle, represents the water level on the Corinthian Gulf side. And what they determined was that the water level on that side versus the Saronic Gulf side was much higher. So they began to wonder, well, what's going to happen when we cut through the land? Won't the waters want to flow from one gulf to the other? And isn't that going to be a problem for all of these islands that may end up covered up by water on the eastern side and the Saronic Gulf side? So they pretty quickly abandoned the idea that they're going to cut through this isthmus of land. And instead, what they did was they built a road. And it's called the Diolkos Way. And the road was essentially grooved out kind of in a half circle. And they laid limestone on the bottom of this to make this a kind of a pathway. Well, so what? So we got a road. How is that going to help getting ships from the west to the east or vice versa? Well, interestingly enough, what they did is they used that road and they would essentially unload the ships that would dock in the Corinthian port on the west side. And these ships, you have to remember, were much smaller than our modern day ships. And what they would do is they would unload all the goods. They'd put the goods on pack animals. They would have somebody take the pack animals 4 miles across the isthmus to the other harbor on the other side in the east, and then they would reload the ship. Well, how'd they get the ship from one side to the other? And this animation kind of illustrates what they would do. They had these little vehicles that they would pull the ship onto. The little vehicle, the little platform, would be greased with animal fat to make it slippery, and they would use slaves or prisoners to actually pull that vehicle that was loaded with the ship 4 miles on this Diolkos way, this Diolkos road, to the other side. And then they would reload the ship with the goods that the pack animals had carried across the 4-mile isthmus of land. It seems unbelievable that this is what was taking place, but actually this reduced the time of the voyage in half. Instead of sailing around that southern aspect of the Peloponnese, they would cut across that isthmus, they would pull the ships across, and it would save half the sailing time. So if they needed, because of reasons of war, or they were going after pirates, or whatever the reason, they needed to get quickly from one side to the other, this is how they would do it. Interestingly enough, this is one of the reasons that Corinth became such a wealthy city, is because you had all these sailors on these ships that would go and spend their time in the city of Corinth while their ship was being pulled by the slaves or the prisoners across the 4-mile Diolkos way, and as the goods were being packed across. And so they would go and spend their time in the city of Corinth, and they would spend their money. And this is something that took place for quite a period of time, and is one of the ways that Corinth amassed a great amount of wealth. And you can imagine a lot of goods that would be able to come in to the Corinthian harbor as well. And so Corinth had quite the shops that sold a lot of wares, a lot of goods that would be brought in from all over the world. And we'll get to some of that a little bit later. I have some historical pictures of the actual canal once it was finally completed. Amazingly enough, it was attempted to be built by several of the Roman emperors, of course by Periander originally in the 7th century BC, but it was never completed by any of them. In fact, Nero tried. He actually started digging with his own golden pickaxe, and he quickly ended up needing to abandon it as he had to turn his attention to other affairs. But they were never able to make this canal until actually the year 1893. So we went from 7th century BC to 1893, so essentially almost 9 centuries before it was actually completed. And here's one of the historical photos of the actual making of the canal. I've got a couple more here. You can see them blasting some of the rock, the limestone that they had to cut down through to get down deep enough. And I've got some pictures later on. Here's one more picture of the construction of the canal. Very similar to the construction of the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal. It was quite an engineering feat to make this happen. Here's a picture that I actually took looking straight down from a little bridge that crosses over the Corinthian Canal. And you can see the reason why I took it, and I'm sorry that there's that shadow of the bridge in the way, but it was just that time of day, but you can see how solid that rock face is, and that's just solid limestone that goes all the way down. You can see how in the world would they have cut through that with shovels and picks and stuff like that in the 7th century BC. It would take some serious manual labor. Here's another picture of that Corinthian Canal that we took on our trip. Here's another one that shows one of the spans that goes across the canal. Interestingly enough, on this bridge that goes across, there's a bungee platform. So now today you can bungee jump off of that little bridge down towards the water. And I thought that was kind of interesting. There's that same bungee platform. I don't know if you can imagine jumping off of that. Here's a picture of my youngest son, Garrett, kind of looking both ways off that bridge that spans the Corinthian Canal, getting his pictures on his own phone there. Now, here's the completed modern-day canal, and look at this cruise ship that's barely able to squeeze through. This is a pretty narrow canal. It mainly has smaller ships that travel through it, but there are cruises that you can take that and to make your way through the canal, and that's one of the things that we wanted to do, we weren't able to do. But it was very interesting to see that canal, and because it's very pertinent to the history of Corinth and to our story today. Interesting, when we visited the canal, that was part of a tour that we were on. It was a guided tour. And usually when you would take these guided tours, there would be groups of people that would be everywhere at these archaeological sites. We also went to Pompeii. That was one of the places we went to, and there was people everywhere, groups, being guided, and you could hear the tour guides, speaking, and people got their earphones in, listening to what the tour guide is pointing out and describing. But when we went to Corinth, they actually showed us the Corinthian Canal, but they weren't going to take us into the city, so we actually took a taxi on our own on some free time, and we went to Corinth all on our own. Usually we would kind of have to blow through these archaeological sites very quickly and didn't get to spend a lot of time, but we actually got to spend quite a bit of time in Corinth because we weren't on the guided tour, and it was really weird. We were the only people in the entire archaeological site of ancient Corinth, and it was a little bit eerie because we're taking our time, we're taking pictures, we're walking through, thinking about the places where Paul was in the city, and it was just dead quiet. There was nobody there. There was a little museum that was attached that had some artifacts. I took some pictures. I actually took the picture here of this map inside that little museum, and I wanted to point out some of the interesting features of the map. This area that I just encircled in red is the Agora. That's the open area, and this is going to be important for our story today. By the way, I wanted to mention that the city of Corinth is a little bit newer than you would expect because the Romans completely leveled it in 146 BC, and it wasn't until about 44 BC that Julius Caesar said, we're going to rebuild it. And so most of what we see in the archaeological site today was actually built around 44 BC or in the few years around that. And so it's a much newer city. There were some of the ruins from the old city that were preserved, but for the most part, this city was barely 100 years old by the time Paul arrived there. And there are some differences between the old city and the old culture and the newer city of Corinth. But that's the Agora that I've outlined there. And then I wanted to show you there. That arrow is pointing to where the Bema was. The Bema was the platform where the governor or the proconsul would, at times, they would have a portable chair that they would set on top of the Bema, and that would be where there would be people that needed to have some kind of a trial or some kind of a hearing by somebody to make some kind of a decision for them. And there would be certain days that the governor or the praetor or whoever was in charge at that time, they would set his chair, he would sit in the chair, and while he's sitting in the chair, that's your time to come and bring whatever issue you had for judgment before him. And we're going to see later in the scriptures this morning in Acts chapter 18 that Paul is going to be brought before the Bema by the Jews. And that's exactly where it's located at. This area, this line of red, is one of the stoas. It's one of the porch areas. This would be where there would be a covered area with a lot of different stalls, and essentially this was a market. And we can imagine Paul actually being able to sell, because he worked there when he first arrived as a tent maker, along with Priscilla and Aquila. We can imagine them taking up residence in one of these stalls at some point. And here's a picture of one of those porched areas that would be covered, and if it was raining, they would have a cover over the top of them. If it was hot outside, they'd have some shade. And essentially, it was a big market out there. And you can imagine Paul out there at times selling the tent material that he was known for being an artist of. Here's a picture of myself and my oldest son, Tyler. And this is in front of the Temple of Apollo. This had more like 52 columns when it was originally built before it was destroyed by the Romans in 146. There's only a few of these columns left. And this is one of the most distinguishing landmarks when you're at the city, the ancient city of Corinth. I took this picture inside the museum. It's a mosaic tile hanging, and it was beautiful. And so, we look at sometimes at these ruins and we just think how bleak it is, and it just looks like a bunch of stones. But actually, the artistry that was present at the time was amazing. What these people could do, the pottery. There was I remember, I didn't take a picture of it, but there was a little doll that had been made out of stone, and it had articulating joints, and I saw a little pull toy that was in the shape of like a Trojan horse, and it would have been made to have been pulled by a kid, you know, down the road, just like things we would have today. So it was really an advanced society in many ways. I have this video, I'm going to have 3 just short clips of video that I took while we were there. This one starts off at the Bema, and let's play that for you now. It's just about 30 seconds or so. Where the Bema was would have been the porch area in front of the Jewish synagogue, where Paul would have been accused of teaching against the Mosaical law, which we can read about in the New Testament. Paul would have walked this street every day for about 18 months, the beginning part of which he would have worked as a tent maker with Priscilla and Aquila. Where he stayed, we don't know. What's amazing is that just over the way down there, when you're from the upper part where the old Temple to Apollo is right there, you can easily see down to the coast. Beautiful waters. Okay, so there was just a short video clip. That was, we were standing in the Agora. I wanted you to see the Bema, because that's where some of the activity from today's lesson is going to take place. Here's a picture of the Bema from straight ahead. In fact, it's got that label, that little sign on it that says the Bema. It was an elevated platform. The synagogue was placed just behind this area and behind that porch, that stoa area that I had just showed you on the map and drawn the red line down. Here's kind of the side view of the Bema, and they've restored some of it so you can see the beauty that it would have had in the day and the majesty. And you can imagine Gallio, the governor at the time, sitting upon this when Paul would have been brought before him by the Jews to try him. And but you can see the Corinthian white marble that's there on the side of that, and how it's adorned at the top and the bottom with the trim pieces. It's amazing. It was intricate, but it must have been quite a beautiful sight in the day at that time. Then I wanted to show you we panned to the left from the Bema. I want to pan to the right from the Bema in the video. And of course, as you're looking from here in the Agora, you can look up to the Acrocorinth and see the temple area up there at the top. See if I can focus in a little bit. And we're going to go take a ride up there by car here, see what it looks like from up top. Okay, so that is kind of the other half of the Agora, and then we panned up to the top of what's called the Acrocorinth, and that is the most elevated portion of the city, and it's really almost an entire city unto itself in the day. And it was obviously a strong fort, stronghold point. Remember, Acro means high point, so remember in Athens it was the Acropolis, Acropolis. Polis means city in the Greek, so it was high point city. This is called the Acrocorinth, and it was used by the military, obviously, to defend the Peloponnese and the northern aspect of Greece from anybody wanting to come up from the southern aspect of Greece up through the north. It'd be very easy to defend without having to have many people to defend it, because the walls were so gigantic. So we took some video. We drove up to the top, and I took some video. I wanted to show you that video up at the top. Here's the gate to the Acrocorinth, overlooking this ancient city of Corinth. What you don't really realize is the incredible view from up on the top here. There's the Corinthian Gulf down there. Beautiful plateaus, all kinds of olive trees and orange trees. And pretty much a 360-degree view once you get to the very top. We're not to the very top right now. Okay, so I wanted you to get the vantage point from up top there. I'm sorry, that's up high, so we had the wind and the microphone on the camera. But I wanted you to see how elevated that was, what a prominent high point that was, how you could actually, if we could get up a little bit higher, you could see both of the gulfs. We could see the Corinthian Gulf, but you could see the Saronic Gulf to the other side as well. Unfortunately, we weren't able to go inside because there weren't any tours that day. We were the only ones there walking around, as I had said before, and so we couldn't go inside. But inside, if we were able to go through that gate, we would have seen one of the most prominent features inside was the temple of Aphrodite. And this is one of the things that the city of Corinth was known for, particularly before it was destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC. The reason why it was well known for this was that there was said to be 1,000 prostitutes that were attached and working for the temple, of Aphrodite. Aphrodite, it was said, was born out of the sea, and she was also supposed to be the goddess of love, but also the protector of sailors and ships. And so you can imagine that the sailors that frequented the harbors on either side of the Isthmus of Corinth would all want to make their way to the Acrocorinth, and they would want to spend time with the prostitutes in the temple up there. And this was one of the reasons why the city had accumulated such an amount of wealth. And it was often said that these sailors, because there were so many temptations in the city of Corinth, there were so many vices. There was over, I think, 30 different bars or pubs, so to speak, that were have been excavated so far in the ancient city of Corinth. So it wasn't only prostitution, but it was alcohol and other vices that was very attractive to people. And they would spend all their money, and these sailors would come in with pocketfuls of money, and they would leave completely broke. It was said that the city, the morals of the city were so debauched, it was so debased there, that they would talk about the women being Corinthianized, and it became a moniker. It became a term of derision, not only in Corinth, but other cities such as Athens used to poke fun at the Corinthians. They would call girls that had low moral standards and would sleep around, they were Corinthianized. They were Corinthian girls. They were Corinthianized. And actually, some of these prostitutes would come down into the town of Corinth from the temple up in the Acrocorinth, and they would actually carve into the bottom of their sandals, "Follow me." And so every place that they would step into the dirt would leave that imprint, "Follow me." And the sailors would actually follow the footsteps of the prostitutes to where they would do their business at. It was an extremely sinful environment, and something that's in some aspects is hard to imagine, that it was that evil, that amount of sin that was taking place. So to imagine Paul coming into that town and seeing the state of the culture there was probably very eye-opening for Paul. Here's a picture from the top just of that Corinthian Gulf that I had taken. When you make your way down, you can see down over the Corinthian Gulf, and all those white structures there is actually the new city of Corinth, and right down there by the water. But just at the bottom of this hill was the ancient city. So there's the new city, and we have the ancient city of Corinth there, and I wanted to show you that. So that kind of concludes the pictures and kind of the history of Corinth. I wanted to move into the text of Acts chapter 18. We'll quickly move through the text here this morning. In verse 2, we see that Paul found a certain Jew named Aquila, who was a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So we're told that he meets Aquila and Priscilla, and they had recently come from Rome because they'd been expelled. Something had happened between the Jews and the Christians in Rome. There was arguments that were taking place over whether Jesus was actually the Messiah. This is written about in some of these secular historical accounts. And Claudius, the emperor of Rome, had just cast all the Jews out. So apparently not long before Paul had arrived in Corinth, Priscilla and Aquila had also had to make their way by force, had to make their way to Corinth, and Paul had probably met them at the Sabbath worship service in the synagogue, which is probably where they would still show up for worship on the Sabbath day, and that's where Paul would have made his way in an effort to try and preach to the Jews, as was his usual custom. And then in verse 4, we see exactly that. We see Paul was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade the Jews and the Greeks. We've seen this word, to reason, in the synagogue, that phraseology we saw before. And remember, the Greek word for reason is dialegomai. That word dialegomai means to have a dialogue, a back and forth, a debate. And Paul would, as his custom, he would go to the Old Testament scriptures. He would point out prophecies of what the Messiah was going to be like, what his personality was going to be like, what kind of a leader he was going to be, that it wasn't going to be an earthly leader, that it was going to be a spiritual leader. And then he would point out the facts of the life of Christ as he knew them, that he was crucified, that he was raised again on the third day. This would have been exactly what he would have preached. He would have laid out the Old Testament text, tried to reason and persuade them that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. This is how Christians are won still today. Every place, this is how it works. You want to convert somebody to Christianity, you've got to share the gospel message with them. It does not happen, as the Calvinists would tell you, by some kind of a direct operation of the third person of the Godhead, the Holy Spirit, upon the heart of the believer. And they believe that the Holy Spirit would touch the heart of the person and they would instantaneously be saved. And the third person of the Godhead would only do that to those who had been pre-elected. So that would do away with free will, the free will of mankind. And so clearly, what would be the purpose of preaching if that were the case? What would be the purpose of trying to persuade, trying to preach in a way that would be convincing? Why have a debate and a back and forth? You wouldn't need to do that if what the Calvinists teach is true. That is one of the principal differences between the churches of Christ and almost all of the denominations. They believe that is how you are saved, this direct operation of the Holy Spirit upon the heart. But I think that we can see what would be the purpose of Paul saying that, well, actually Luke in this instance, the writer, saying that Paul was reasoning, debating back and forth, trying to persuade. There would be no need to persuade if that's how things worked. But we see that in many places in the New Testament, that's how preaching is done, and that's how Christians are won. Verse 5, we see that Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, and when that happened, Paul began devoting himself completely to the Word. Remember the last time I spoke, Paul was in Athens. And remember, he was escorted to Athens by some of the Berean people. And when they parted ways, he gave an instruction to those Bereans to please give a message to Timothy and to Silas to come to me. Apparently, Timothy did make his way to Athens and meet with Paul, but he was quickly turned back to Thessalonica because Paul was very interested to understand how those Christians who were being persecuted in Thessalonica had been doing. He wanted to get news of how they were doing. So Timothy had been sent back to Thessalonica. But now we see in Corinth both Silas and Timothy finally making their way and meeting up with Paul, and apparently they must have brought some funds that had been donated possibly by the Berean church or possibly by the Christians in Thessalonica. They must be bringing some funds to Paul, because at this point Paul says, okay, I don't need to work anymore. We've got enough money. Perhaps he had made enough money in the tent making that he had been doing with Priscilla and Aquila to that point. At any rate, he decided, now I can focus, and he was probably energized by having his missionary colleagues back with him, his friends back with him, and he probably felt like this was the time to invest 100% of my time and my energy into the preaching of the Word again, and that's exactly what he began to do. So we see Paul beginning to spend all his time in the preaching. Verse 6, and when they had resisted and blasphemed, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be upon your own heads. From now on I shall go to the Gentiles. We can imagine that Paul, as he is preaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath day is beginning to encounter resistance. And the word that is used for resistance is a military term. It means an organized resistance. So we can imagine Paul in the synagogue all of a sudden encountering a lot of pushback to his preaching, so much so that he feels that it's organized. And we see him at some point feeling like he is wasting his breath. He's preaching and he is having zero effect. And so at some point at the end of one of these long sermons, one of these long Sabbath day lessons that he had probably been teaching, we can see him frustrated to the point where he takes off his outer garment and he shakes the dust out of it and he said, "Your blood be upon your own heads." And the idea is that on the judgment day, you're going to lose your life. And it wasn't for a lack of my trying to preach the truth to you. And so we can see that very dramatic event taking place. From there in verse 7, we learn that Paul goes to the house of a certain man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God, we're told, whose house was next to the synagogue. Titius Justus is a Roman name. It's surmised that his family had probably been 2 or 3 generations in the city of Corinth. He probably had a lot of connections with the other Roman people in the area. And what a perfect individual that evidently Paul had converted. And now this individual, Titius Justus, is going to be, in his house, is going to be the center of Paul's preaching. He's going to have meetings there. He's going to preach there. And this is where he's going to meet a lot of individuals that Titius is going to introduce him to, more than likely. And so we see that that house is right next door to the synagogue. How convenient is that? In verse 8, we read that Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all of his household, and many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and being baptized as well. So interesting, the timing. Think about that timing. Paul has preached, for probably a considerable period of time in the Sabbath, in the synagogue on the Sabbath days, feeling like he's not making any progress. Then, when he tells the Jews, shakes off his cloak and says, "I'm done with you, your blood be upon your own heads," and then he begins preaching in another environment where the Jews are not so much present. Then Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, finds his way to Titius's house. He is listening to Paul. He is now converted, and we're told not only Crispus, but his entire household is converted. And that goes to show us a very important thing, that there's a lot of pressure when we preach the word. There's a lot of pressure on the individual that we may be studying or working with that we may not be aware of. There's a lot of societal pressures, cultural pressures, family pressures, other religious pressures, and it sounds like that's exactly what was going on in the case of Crispus. He was evidently, by peer pressure from this organized resistance to Paul's preaching, didn't feel like he could raise his hand and say, "Hey, I want to study. I want to hear more of what you have to say." He had to wait until Paul left and started preaching out of the house of Titius before he felt comfortable enough to actually go and probably sit in Paul's audience and listen and study and come to the idea that, okay, I believe that Jesus is the Christ. I think he is the Messiah that was prophesied about in the Old Testament. That's something that we always need to remember. Paul had planted the seed. He thought he was going nowhere at that point. That's why he left. Otherwise, he would have continued to preach in the synagogue. But he thought he was making no progress. But he had planted the seed. Crispus came and found him and then was converted. I wanted to point that out. I think that's important for us to keep in mind. The next 3 verses, verses 9 through 11, I really wanted to focus on. We're told that the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, "Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city." And he settled there 1 year and 6 months. I find this interesting. Firstly, we see that God is speaking to Paul in the night by a vision. Remember, there's a difference. God would frequently come to his people either in visions, which would typically be during the day. They would be in a state of being awakened. And a vision would be something that would take place while you're awake versus a dream, a message that God would give you in a dream would be when you were asleep. So here we have Paul at night, we're told, but he's having a vision. Why is he up at night? It sounds like he is fearful. Maybe he's already become fearful for his life, and perhaps he's unable to sleep. He's restless, and now God comes to him in a vision and says, don't be afraid any longer. And we imagine that Paul had probably been in Corinth for about 6 months up to this point. We read at the end of this verse that he stays there another 18 months. So we imagine Paul being in the city of Corinth for approximately 2 years in totality. But I wanted us to focus on what he told him. He said, I do not want you to be silent. That is such an important instruction from God our Father to Paul and to you and to me, especially in light of what we have seen in the last several weeks in America. I feel like we have so many pressures in America converging and coming to an apex. And it's interesting that it's happening during this coronavirus, which adds more pressure onto the whole situation. Wanted to show you a picture. We had opening day of baseball finally during this coronavirus pandemic, and we've gone without sports for so long, but finally we were able to have baseball again. 2 nights ago was opening day, and I have a picture here of the pregame activities, the national anthem. Before the national anthem, they had a unity moment for the Black Lives Movement. And here's a picture of the San Francisco Giants. Everybody is kneeling except for one individual. This is a pitcher for the San Francisco Giants. His name is Sam Conrud. And I read an article where he had said, I didn't kneel. He was the only one on both sides of the field that didn't kneel. He said, I couldn't kneel because I'm a Christian. And they asked him to explain himself. And he said, well, the Black Lives Movement is a Marxist movement. And as a Christian, I can't go along with that. It also is derogatory towards the nuclear family, having a mother and a father in the house. They promote LGBTQ movement and lifestyle, amongst other things. And so he stated, as a Christian, I can't get on board with these things and I can't promote. And besides that, I'm going to kneel before nobody but God the Father and Jesus my Lord. That's what he said. And I thought, wow, you know what? He's going to take a lot of heat, and he already is. There's articles everywhere written about Sam. And I am so proud of somebody like that to take a stand physically and, for a mental picture for everybody to see what it's like to be a bold and courageous Christian and to stand for your principles. He didn't speak with his mouth, but his actions spoke louder than probably any words could. And I wanted to show you that. And what do you think about what he said? He talked about Marxism. What does Marxism have to do? And incidentally, you have to be able to separate the Black Lives organization from the idea, the concept that Black Lives Matter. We all agree that Black Lives Matter. Nobody disagrees with that. But the Black Lives Movement organization really doesn't have anything to do with the promotion of anti-racism. It really has to do with changing the way America functions as a country from its most basic foundational supports and pillars. The people who organized it and started it are avowed Marxists. They are not shy about stating that. You think about Marxism as being just another variation of socialism. The same thing, communism is another variation of socialism. Well, what's wrong with that? Why should Christians be against Marxism or communism or socialism? Because those forms of government, they concentrate power at the top. They tell you what to believe. They tell you what the morals of the day should be. They tell you what kind of job you should have. You cannot have religion in a communist society. Look at China. My son went to China over the summer between his freshman and sophomore year of college. He's studying to speak Chinese as part of his major. And he had to spend about 2 hours every day trying to make it to an underground Church of Christ there for him to worship on Sundays. He'd have to ride a subway. He'd have to walk a long ways from the subway. It's not advertised anywhere where to meet. Why? Why? Because They don't want somebody else giving you any ideas of how to think, what's moral and what's not moral. They want to tell you what that is. That's exactly why Sam, the San Francisco Giants pitcher, said, I can't be on board with Marxism. I can't be on board with that. And obviously, the other elements of that, the promotion of the LGBTQ movement, is obviously something that is inimical to Christian tenets and to how God wants us to behave. The other thing that's kind of coming to an apex in society, if you've been watching TV and following the news, is Jeffrey Epstein. He's the billionaire investor who had a private island that he was flying all kinds of politicians, Hollywood folks, people that have a lot of money and important people in society to this private island where he apparently was running a pedophilia ring. And we have one of the ladies that was helping him groom some of the kids for this activity, Ghislaine Maxwell, has now been arrested in the last few days. And she's getting ready to reveal, and different people from government, highest levels of our government, highest levels of other governments, such as in England, people that were participating in these activities, many people from Hollywood, and he was apparently secretly videoing them so he'd have leverage over people. And we know that when Jeffrey Epstein was finally arrested for all of this, that he was killed in prison. They said he committed suicide, but the elements surrounding it make it obvious there was something fishy going on. Now they're afraid for Ghislaine Maxwell's life, that before she is able to tell the story, she's going to be killed. So they are watching her very carefully. But we see this activity infiltrating our culture, pedophilia. You would never imagine 50 years ago in America that this would be an issue. And yet, all of a sudden, in the last few weeks and months, we see this activity coming to the forefront, and it's just an isolated case here or there. We're talking about top politicians in our government. We're talking about people that we've watched in the movies for decades, people that we think are great actors and actresses that have been involved with this. Unbelievable. Not only that, we have in over 20 states within the United States, we have the Catholic Church being investigated for the exact same thing, where priests are engaging in pedophilia. We have countries in Latin America right now today where there's recent articles where they don't even have enough priests to deliver the sacraments. Why? Because they have been removed or recalled from their positions because they have either been convicted of pedophilia and they're in jail, or they are being currently investigated for it. The sad thing about this type of behavior is that it tends to affect the children in a way that they tend to continue this behavior themselves when they become adults. And so we see a vicious cycle and a population of people that is growing and growing, and it's so much more prolific than anybody ever knew in the United States. And it is so sad. We know that the guilt, the emptiness that these victims of abuse have, the manifesting of that same sinful sexual behavior themselves in their own life, committing these terrible crimes against children themselves, it is having such an impact on our society today that I don't think we realize it. So many of us are in our own bubbles and don't realize what's going on in the world around us. And it's tragic, but I think it's much more prolific than we knew. And when we compare today's culture and sinful activities that are taking place to what was happening in the time that Paul was visiting Corinth, they're pretty comparable. And I don't know that we've seen anything new in the world. Nothing is new. We've seen pedophilia before, but now here we're seeing a reemergence of it. And so it's easy to look back at Corinth and think, wow, those people that was evil times. We're seeing the same things here today, right under our nose in the United States. The other thing that we're seeing come to an apex is the existence of satanic cults and satanic churches, the promotion of Satanism right in front of us, trying to put up statues and things to Satan. We're starting to see images of satanic elements in movies, in music videos. We're seeing Hollywood embrace Satanism to an extent. How much we're still not sure yet, but we're starting to see this crop up. And one of the things that comes to mind, and that it is starting to become much more apparent, is that we are really seeing a struggle between good and evil in the world. And that's exactly what has always been taking place. Satan is allowed to operate in this world. We know that God is ultimately in charge, but I think about what was written by Paul in his letter to the Ephesian church in chapter 6, verses 12 and 13. He said, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of darkness," which shows the scope of this. This is all over the world. "Against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places." This is a spiritual battle between Satan and the forces of good. It really is. It really is. And Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, how does he say to battle this? He says, "Therefore take up the full armor of God, so that you may be able to resist in the evil day, and having done everything, to stand firm." It is going to take an enormous, courageous, bold effort for us to stand firm in the face of the evil and the sinfulness that is happening all around us in society. Satan is active, and he is looking to steal your soul. And he is making inroads in parts of America that we would have never thought, in ways we would have never have expected. And he is snatching souls from God's hand today. And that does happen. And he's looking to snatch your soul, and he's looking for an opportunity to snatch my soul. And it's going to take courageous and bold Christians like Paul, who would not keep his mouth closed in Corinth, but instead he preached the word. Like Sam, San Francisco pitcher, who refused to kneel. It's going to take those kind of efforts in the face of opposition that we would have never have imagined even 5 or 10 years ago. But now we are seeing it. We see that when we speak the tenets of Christianity and we tell people what we believe, that we are going to receive opposition, and it's getting ready to get ugly. And we're going to have to use every fiber of our being to stand firm and to open our mouths and continue to preach the word. Interestingly enough, Paul was successful in Corinth. In spite of the evil that was taking place, he was able, because he was courageous and continued to preach, to convert many of the Jews and many of the Romans that were there. One of the Romans that he converted, and we're only given the names of a few of them, like such as Chloe and Erastus. Erastus was the treasurer of Corinth, and actually when you go visit the archaeological site, there is about a 6-foot-long banner that was made out of bronze that said that Erastus, the treasurer of Corinth, paved this road with his own finances. And most of the bronze is gone off the sign. Just a couple of spots of bronze are still left, but there's evidence of somebody that Paul converted still in existence in the city of Corinth today. Very interesting. But these are evil people that we have in the world today, and you can see how angry they are. You can see how frustrated they are, how empty they are. And many of them, just as in Corinth, are silently searching for something better. They want to hear something. They want to hear that there's something out there for them, that God loves them, that there's an opportunity for a better life in the next world. And if we can just get the message out there and not be silent, we, like Paul, can bring many, just as Paul did, into the church. Verses 12 through 17, we see that Gallio, he was the proconsul when he ascended to the governorship, essentially, over the southern aspect of Greece, Achaia. There's Macedonia in the north and Achaia in the south. that the Jews used this as an opportunity to try and grab Paul, bring him before Gallio, who was sitting upon the bema in judgment one day. And they brought their arguments that he was teaching against the Jewish religion. And Gallio essentially responded that, if this was a matter of a vicious crime or some other crime that was committed, I would be interested in this. But this is a matter of your own questions of your own religion. I'm not interested in this. And they ran the Jews who had brought Paul, I'm sure, in an angry mob before Gallio. They ran them away from the bema. And we learn also that the new leader of the synagogue was beaten right there in front of the bema. So things didn't go exactly as was planned for the Jews as they grabbed Paul and brought him before the bema to be tried. So when God told Paul, "Do not be afraid any longer in the middle of the night, for I have many friends in this city," he wasn't kidding. And the script was completely flipped on the Jews who tried to have Paul tried and arrested, and instead their own Jewish synagogue leader was beaten. God is in control, although Satan is allowed to operate. And why is Satan allowed to operate? God wants you to make a choice. You are either going to affirm with your mouth that he and his son, Jesus, is the Christ, the Messiah that was prophesied in the Old Testament scriptures, that he is your Lord and your Savior, and you put him on in baptism and become part of the family of Christ, or you deny him and you stay seated and you kneel before Satan. Those are the options. It is a spiritual battle between good and evil. And I'm reminded of Romans 1:16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to the Jew first and then to the Gentile." We cannot be ashamed of preaching the gospel of Christ. That's all for this morning. Thank you for your attention and being with us this morning. If you have a need for prayer for the congregation on your behalf, please let us know. If you have not put on Christ in baptism, I urge you to stand up and to make a stand and to do that today. Thank you.